Hi everyone, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and today I'm going to take a look at a very old game of mine, played back in 1986, and sadly my rating was about the same or even a little bit higher back then. This is a training game I played against an expert friend of mine. At least I think it was a training game. I don't think it was from a rated match, although we had played one earlier. Anyway, I had white in this game, and we'll quickly get to the critical position, or at least the position that struck me as interesting here. Okay, so this is me against Charles McVoy, so I'll go ahead and give his name. Old acquaintance of mine from Las Vegas. Okay, so we had lots of disputes in the modern Benoni, and I don't know if we had this position in particular more than once. We might have, but anyway, here it is. It turns out there was a game actually played in this position the year before between Glenn Fleer, who is a grandmaster now. I'm not sure if he was a grandmaster back then. He's either that or an IM, and a player named Kaiser played in Buende in 1985. And in that game, black played knight b to d7 and was actually quite okay. So here's how that game continued, and it might give you some ideas for the positions we'll look at later. c4 is nice. And here, black is doing perfectly well. Very good active play. He went on to lose. Actually, not too many moves later. I think it was just a tactical error. But here, he's doing fine. So, okay, that's Fleer Kaiser. Okay, my opponent played f5, and here I played pretty aggressively here. So I took and played g4, which I think is okay. Bishop c8, knight e to e4, queen e7, bishop to d3, just kind of lining everybody up. Knight b to d7, and here white to move. So this is the position that struck me as especially interesting. So the background is I was looking through some old games of mine a few days ago, basically just trying to find some games I hadn't seen in a long time, and came across this one, and this kind of interested me, so I was kind of curious. Okay, you know, how, in what ways maybe was I better back then? What ways might I be better at this point? And so I decided to kind of make a solitaire game exercise out of this around here. So see what you come up with. I've shown this to a couple of expert friends, and they've come up with some different ideas too. Okay, well, hopefully you'll have stopped the recording and done your best to figure it out. If you haven't, you still have another chance to do so. But I'll go ahead and mention a number of moves here. So one move that a friend of mine, who's an expert, as I said, thought of was rook to e1. So this struck him as a move. And it makes sense. Okay, you're putting the rook on an open file. And, you know, there's some vague threats involving the queen at this point, although we'd have to support the rook on e1 first. I'm not sure that it's that great, but I think it probably gives or keeps some small advantage for white. So, for instance, black could play a move like queen to h4, and we can see that black can get pretty decent counterplay. So bishop to d2, knight to b6. Okay, so now the pawn on g4 is under attack. c4 might be happening. Sometimes the d5 pawn might be weak. So bishop to e2. It's a little bit passive, but seems to be okay. I mean, I think white is kind of holding everything together, and it also gets out of the way of c4 stuff, which could then be met by a5. Okay, bishop to d4 check, king h1. And maybe at this point it's hard for black to really go forward. He could try an exchange sack, which may not be so bad. But I'm not sure that black has quite enough activity to have full compensation here. Okay, black could play queen h5, but then knight e4 forces a knight to come to d7. So that'll just transpose. So knight f to d7, knight e4, queen h5, threatening bishop to f3, of course. So rook a3 is pretty good, activating the rook. Knight c4, rook g3, takes, knight f6. So something like this could be played. Again, black has some compensation. He's got a bishop and a pawn for the rook. White has a kind of questionable pawn structure. On the other hand, black has some potential weaknesses of his own, like the pawns on d6 and b7, and the e-file looks like a promising asset for white as well. So I think white's a bit better here. Okay, so that was rook to e1. All right, another idea from another friend is queen f3. Just kind of building up here, and this makes some sense. Although at first it's a little bit funny because it seems to be building up for f5, but then it would walk into knight e5. So it's a little bit funny from that point of view, but of course the queen could also move someplace else. It could go to g3. And it just clears the path, so you could play bishop to d2 and rook a to e1 would be another way to continue with, I think, reasonable chances of building up an initiative. Now here, I think black has several reasonable continuations. So one is just to play b6 and finish developing, bring the fianchetto the bishop, connect the rooks. Another is the active c4, which we won't look at here, but we'll look at in some similar lines. I decided for fun last night before doing the show, just for kicks, to see what Rybka using the Monte Carlo method would come up with here. Which of all the possibilities it would prefer, just based on using that method. And I think the way that works is it plays essentially a ton of really fast speed games with itself, just thousands and thousands, and generates a book based on that. So white actually did very well with queen f3 and f5 both. So we'll come to f5 shortly. But queen f3, its main line, was knight f6. I think that's probably worse than c4. But okay, I mean, like I said, it's really playing just tons and tons of fast games. Okay, f5, gf, gf. And it makes sense for white to play f5 now that there's no one mover by a black knight to e5. Okay, knight 8 to d7, queen g3. So we get out of the way, and we pressure f6, d6. I can maybe follow up with bishop to f4, or bishop h6, or bishop to g5. So all three moves are possible on this diagonal. Okay, c4, bishop c2, takes. Okay, now getting out of the way, and white can grab on d6. And white is able to neutralize and eliminate this black initiative. And okay, some of its lines. Okay, here it came up with rook f8 every time. Bishop takes d5 is better, but white can just neutralize this with rook f8 check. And then rook takes e4. And ultimately, white gets a winning ending. So still up the exchange for a pawn, but black has so many weaknesses here that white should be winning this. Okay, instead of bishop takes d5, there's rook f8, queen d6. Alright, and white's definitely winning here. I mean, the pawn on f7 is humongous. Black's pieces are kind of strewn about, and yeah, I mean, at some point, white is going to take over a dark square somewhere on the diagonal, and when that happens, then black just falls apart. Okay, so queen f3 is actually pretty interesting, although again I think knight f6 is kind of easygoing. b6 or maybe even c4 I think are more resistive. Alright, really what it came down to in the game, well okay, in the game I played f5, and I noticed that I recorded the times and I think I spent a minute on it. And f5, okay, speaking about it from a kind of general standpoint, obviously it's a very aggressive move. Prepares to bring the bishop to g5. It threatens f6. So it's a very straightforward, energetic approach. It's also a little bit positionally risky, though, because we're giving up, of course, the e5 square in particular, which looks a little bit scary. And, well, in the game it worked out magnificently. So here's what happened in the game. So my opponent took, played bishop to d4 check, king h1, knight f6, and okay, my knight on c3 is superfluous here, so I swap and then I bring that one to e4. Okay, knight to d7, now queen h5, and you can just see all my pieces are zipping into the attack here. The bishop's going to come to g5 or to h6 or to f4. The rook comes to g1 check. Okay, I'm also threatening knight takes d6. It's not really anything too constructive my opponent can do about it. Rook f8, bishop h6, or rook anywhere, then I can play that. and again kill him on the H file, on the G file, pardon me. So he just got out of the way and gave me the pawn and played rook to F8. All right, well, my knight is great on D6. There's no real reason to retreat it, so I play bishop to F4. He can take the pawn on B2. Who cares? Rook A to E1. And I mean, you can see white's just attacking with everything at this point. So he tried knight F6, and you know, it's a logical move, but it's just too late. Rook E7, bishop H6, and his rook has no moves. Okay, if he goes to G8, knight F7 is mate. If he goes to D8, knight F7 doesn't mate. Well, it doesn't mate on the move, but it wins the rook. And so he tries bishop to G7, and now takes, F6, and he's just dead. And he resigned here. So the threat's just rook takes H7 after the knight moves, and then rook to G1, which forces mate. So that was the game. Very nice, very, very powerful, and all kinds of wonderful encomia can be heaped upon it. But black could have played better, of course. So after F5, G takes F5, G takes F5. The right move here was knight to F6. And there's a key difference. Okay, let's say I play as in the game. Knight takes F6, bishop F6, knight to E4, knight D7, queen H5, king H8. Well, now I cannot take on D6 because rook to G8 check saves the rook. See, before it was, of course, if queen takes D6, I have queen takes E8. But check, which he didn't have when he played bishop to D4 check first. So that little point makes all the difference in the world. Okay, of course I'm still better, but it's not as much. Bishop to F4, rook check, and knight to E5. And now we see this revenge of the dark squares. So now, of course, E5 is his forever, and the bishop is okay on F6. I mean, if I take, he recaptures, and I don't have bishop to G5 right away. So, you know, he's got some chances. I mean, okay, I'm definitely better here. There's no real question about that. But he's at least kind of cobbling together a defense at this point. Okay. Also, after knight F6, okay, so F5, GF5, GF5, knight F6. Instead, another way, and this is another bit of Ribka Monte Carloing, is just to play bishop to F4 straight away. All right, on this, then knight takes E4, knight E4, and bishop F5. So that's what I lose out of going in this way. And but here in the long run too, it looks like white is doing well. Knight D6, takes, bishop takes B2, rook A to B1, check, knight G6, and okay, black is just in trouble, of course. And at the end of the day, white's just up the exchange and can very easily work around black's dark squared bishop. And that wins. Just one big exchange, and then the D pawn promotes. All right, now again, this is not a forcing variation. Well, it's a forcing line, but the moves in the line aren't all forced. So it's just interesting, and it shows some of the possibilities. Okay, but what I finally want to close with is the move that I came up with now as an older player. Okay, not old, but certainly older than I was back in '86. So in '86, I just thought, okay, let's attack. There doesn't seem to be any tactical problem with F5. Nothing he seems to be able to do immediately with the E5 square. So let's just go forward. All right, I certainly considered F5 now too, but here I found a different move, G5. And this is simply another interesting way to handle the position. So we saw, okay, rook to E1 is one way. We kind of create little semi-threats. Queen F3 building up to another approach. F5, just playing for the initiative as forcefully as possible, is another very good approach. But G5 is also, I think, a very interesting approach. And the point is simply that black's pieces are all practically stalemated in this position. What can he move? So he has no access to E5. Okay, so knight can't go to E5 because of this. Can't go to F6 because of this pawn. Okay, this knight can't go to E6 because of the D5 pawn. It can't move anywhere else because of his own stuff. The E file is clogged up. Okay, the bishop on C8 can't move because, of course, of its own knight on D7. because of the bishop on c8, the rook on a8 has nowhere really to go. The rook on a8 is constipated by the queen on e7, and the queen on e7 can't move because the d6 pawn is hanging. So isn't this fun? So I like this g5 idea quite a lot. Just constrict him and not let him do anything in the position at all. So, for instance, if black plays something normal, let's say rook to b8. Okay, actually a couple of moves. Yes, we'll start with rook to b8. Okay, now I can play rook to e1, threatening knight f6 check. And if he retreats, then I just take. And he does get a little bit of counterplay here for the pawn that he's sacrificed / lost, but not really enough. Okay, so if queen takes c8, then just either f5 I think is probably best, or bishop to e3. Either way, white has, I think, a clear advantage. I mean, black has insufficient compensation for the pawn. And he could win it back, actually, by taking on c3 and taking on d5. But, well, let's take a quick look. Takes, queen takes, knight here, bishop c4. And, okay, actually, in this case, he's probably just losing the knight. But even waiving this, I mean, just the pressure on this diagonal and on this diagonal is going to be horrible. So this can't be done. Okay, instead of queen takes c8, maybe rook takes c8. So we keep more pressure on the d5 pawn. All right, a5, and now if he takes, then bishop c4, and we just again pile up. Okay, bishop to e3, preparing rook to d1, knight e6, rook to d1. Here, and now f5 is just winning with the point that if g takes f4, bishop f4, and you just get sliced up with all of these pins. I'd take on c7 next, and then take on d5, winning a piece. And if queen to e5, then bishop c5, and again we have pin heaven here. So it's pinned this way, pinned that way, pinned this way, and he'll get out of all these pins very soon by just losing a knight. Okay, so that was rook c8, a5, knight takes d5. If he tries c4, so a little counterattacking action, then bishop e4, takes, and again, okay, if he doesn't take the pawn, then I just have an extra pawn in a great position, and if he does take, then again we start piling up here, and now bishop to e3, and so I'm just going to play bishop to d4, and basically drill a hole in him with these diagonal pieces. And white is winning in this position. Okay, not necessarily an immediate tactical blow, but there's no way for black to ultimately survive such a position. All right, and then finally, after a5, okay, another try is bishop to d4 check, king h1, and now take. So the idea is that he can play queen takes d5 check. But even so, all right, after all of this, what can he do? He can't move the knight because bishop c4 wins the queen. And the checks run out. So the white king goes to c2 and to b1 if necessary, and I'm just up a piece and winning. Okay, and then finally, if instead of queen takes d5, black tries c4, then bishop f1, and again bishop takes c4 is winning. My pin is going to beat his pin. Okay, so that was after knight c8, rook takes c8. Okay, and I already mentioned queen c8. So, third move, bishop to d4 check, if he tries to throw this in. And then play knight takes c8, just for variety. Then f5. And white has a clear advantage here as well. Big advantage in this position. Okay, so rook to b8, I think, after I play g5, doesn't really do very much. I can just keep building and we'll have a great advantage. Another possibility is to play knight to b8. Okay, it looks ridiculous, but man's got to do what a man's got to do. And, okay, it gives black a couple of possibilities. So one is to play, of course, the bishop to f5, or maybe to h3. And also maybe clears c7 for the queen, and then c4. Okay, a number of ideas. All right, so rook to e1. Well, here queen c7 doesn't work because of knight to f6 check. So queen d8. Okay, now bishop to e3. So we take care of bishop to d4 stuff, or at least neutralize it. Bishop f2. Knight b to d7, takes, and okay, if bishop to d4, and this, okay, this is just nothing, white's winning, And if queen b6, okay, this is a little bit interesting. But again, white's just much better. Up a pawn, I have pressure on c5, and if he plays queen takes b2, then I have rook to b1 and rook b7. So this is terrible for black as well. All right, what else have we got? We've got, finally, I think this is the best try for black. After g5, you should maybe just kick a pawn away with c4 and go for activity. You know, forget the pawn. Whatever you can do to gain a tempo and gain a little space is for the best. But here too, I think white can just grab the pawn and enjoy life. So takes, knight b6, bishop to d3. Okay, and I'm going to play a5 if black doesn't do anything special here and just drive him back. So, okay, bishop to f5, at least he gets the bishop out. a5, rook e1, and again, white's just clearly better. And I could protect the pawn, but it's even better to just give it up. So for instance, if takes here, and again, my bishops are way better than his knights, which are still pretty much dominated, and also the b7 pawn could be weak, but it's more likely that I'm going to try to crush him on the long diagonal here. Or if queen takes c3 straight away, then rook c4, bishop e4, and again, white's in great shape. Okay, so that was bishop to f5. Another try is queen c7, a5, knight c4. So this is pretty logical, but still, knight f6. And again, white is just better. I mean, black does have a bit of play. So black has a little bit of play, but his king side is weak. His pieces aren't really coordinating in any substantive way. I mean, you can see some of them look kind of nice. The bishop on h3 looks good, but no one's helping him. The knight on c4 looks good, but again, what's it doing there? It's likely to get driven back. And, you know, things like maybe b3 or something that kicks the knight. Maybe rook to a4 would make more sense. Knight takes a5 and then f5, for instance, might be a way of trying to cause black some severe damage quickly. So, you know, this is possible, but it doesn't really impress too much. Okay, and then finally another try is bishop to d4 check, and then bishop to f5, just being active. But again, this is kind of similar. I play knight to g3, queen f7, and he gets a little bit of play, but I get the better of it. Okay, so I'm threatening knight f6, and on knight to d7 I have rook takes b7. And position like this, okay, black has some drawing chances, but still, with the extra pawn, but more than that, very active rook, strong pawn on f6, and his king really still in a bit of danger. White enjoys a significant edge. Okay, now the details aren't overwhelmingly important here, but what is, I think, very interesting is just how many different ways there are to play, and I think that it kind of reveals your personality, your understanding of the game, and things like that. So again, it's very easy for me to sort of stereotype the young version of myself, you know, just active, forward, forward, forward. Let's just knock this guy out. And f5 is a perfect move to do that, and it worked like a charm. Okay, the old and crusty me is certainly aware of that possibility, and I still kind of like it, but I also see the e5 square and shudder and grimace a little bit. And, you know, I wouldn't play f5 without calculating it pretty seriously, whereas back then I clearly just didn't worry about it. I mean, I just assumed, okay, it's a square, but I've got 63 other squares to play with, and I'm going to mate him before he does anything nice with f5. So, whoop-de-doo. One other thing I can say in favor of that approach is, well, you remember earlier in this presentation I talked about the idea of the superfluous piece. So I was referring to my knights on c3 and e4, which are kind of backing each other up. So of course it was appropriate for me to, when he played knight f6, to play knight f6 and then bring the second knight to e4. Well, a somewhat different version of it, of this idea of superfluous piece, comes into play here, where black has 5 units that attack the e5 square, 4 of which can move to that square and at least theoretically use it. But the problem, of course, is that you can only use it one at a time, and any piece that does in fact occupy it will interfere with the other three pieces that would also like to use it. So yeah, he can get e5, but he still remains pretty clogged up even after that. But all the same, there's the further idea of playing g5, which I kind of like too. So the drawback of g5 is that it gives up the f5 square. But the f5 square is kind of easier to overwhelm with knight to g3. And I could not only take it over, but some cases still maybe play f5. So it's interesting. I mean, I think both approaches are viable and quite strong, and even other moves which didn't strike me as interestingly, at least back then. Although I had a little more sympathy for queen f3 now, but this is playable too. So the simple approach of building up and keeping the powder dry and waiting. And maybe on knight f6, okay, you can maybe swap and play h3 or something to keep him off of the g4 square. So still a kind of restraining approach. All right, well, just shows how rich the game is, I think, that such fundamentally different approaches can all be pretty good. So I think f5 and g5 are best, but I think queen f3 is also pretty good, and even rook to e1 is at least worthy of some consideration, although I think that one's clearly the weak sister out of the bunch. Okay, well, thank you very much, and hope you enjoyed this. It's, again, something a little bit different, but I think it's worthwhile, and I think shows a number of things, including style, personality. Let's say your evolution of understanding. So certainly I was aware of the concept of prophylaxis back in 1986, but I would say it didn't play as big a role in my chess thinking as it does today. So again, for that reason, G5 kind of springs to mind. Anyway, so you can have fun thinking about these ideas and perhaps psychoanalyzing me a little bit, though I hope not too much. And anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot. See you next time. Bye-bye.